Hey, what's up, Unbroken Nation? Speaking of process, right? And that obviously being the crux of this whole thing when it comes to art therapy, I would love if you would just kind of define what art therapy is and how that differs from other forms of therapy and kind of integrated within that. Like, what is the process?
Mhm. Yeah, so art therapy is a master's level mental health profession, so the same as a licensed professional counselor, a social worker, a marriage and family therapist. And a lot of people don't know that it is a licensed profession that requires that you attend an accredited master's level art therapy program. And as I shared before, you have to have a background in psychology and visual arts in order to even enter that program. And in a practical sense, what it is like within an art therapy session is that your therapist is engaging you in the active process of art making, so of visual art. And then there's also some verbal processing. So it's not entirely you just go make art and the therapist stares at you, but it's also not entirely talking like regular talk therapy. You're doing both, and it can look different depending on the art therapist, depending on their approach. But it definitely takes place within that psychotherapeutic relationship. Many people will say just that their hobby of doing art that is therapeutic is art therapy, or certainly I've seen adult coloring books that actually say art therapy on the cover. And there are art therapists all over the globe. They get up in arms about that because that is not art therapy. When those first got popular, every art therapist in the world was so angry because it is therapy, and coloring in a coloring book is a therapeutic art activity. It's actually what we would call art as therapy. So your weekend hobby is painting landscapes is art as therapy, but art therapy takes place within an art therapy session with a trained and licensed art therapist.
So, as someone, so this is, it's really interesting to me. I was thinking the other day, I have done every modality of healing that you can imagine except art therapy. Like this, as we were preparing for this show, I was thinking to myself, like, damn, I've done everything: Reiki, Gestalt, NLP, CBT, EMDR, like you name it, like all of the things. And I was like, I've never done art therapy before. But as a kid, I distinctly remembered, like, I love to draw. Like I would always be drawing in school or reading a book because I didn't give a shit about school. So I would just sit there and like draw and create. And I remember it being this beautiful process, except I kept getting in trouble. And now in real time, I'm like, I wonder if that's a boundary and a limiting belief that I have to work through to step into art. But I also think like maybe my art is this, you know what I mean? So for someone who is kind of like sitting in there, like in there with you, they're processing art as therapy, they're going through this. What's transpiring? Like how can art therapy be used in actually healing trauma? Where's the connection happen?
Mhm. Yeah. So I'm actually going to go a little more in depth in this with you on this podcast because I think this is the place to do it to really get into what's happening in the brain. Art therapy really activates the right and left sides of our brain, and art therapists really use this strategically, and it involves how we kind of what directives we give. Sometimes it's super open ended, and sometimes we give a specific directive to the client, and also involves what type of art media we choose. So I'm going to get into the art media in just a minute because I think that's the more sort of practical piece of this that listeners can actually apply to their own art making at home, even if it's not quote unquote art therapy. That's something I love sharing about how we interact with the media and how that affects our brains. But first, I'm going to share kind of a more in depth foundation of that. And so there's this concept in art therapy called the expressive therapies continuum. And you can picture that as sort of a diagram of three lines, three three horizontal lines, and then there's one vertical line down the middle. And so I guess first I'll explain that in trauma treatment, we approach it either from a bottom up approach or a top down approach. And bottom up means we're kind of starting kind of in our body, in our senses, and the sensory and kinesthetic components of our physical experience and our emotions. And then kind of moving up to the cognitive and kind of making more sense of it in what I call our thinking brain. So kind of we start in our feeling brain, and move into our thinking brain to make more cognitive sense of things. And from the top down approach, we might start in our thinking brain and move to our feeling brain. And so an art therapist is going to really gauge where a client is, if they're really in their emotion and need to start expressing that, or if they really cannot access their emotions and they're stuck in the cognitive, then we start there. You meet the client where they are. And both are important though for healing. So you want to integrate the cognitive and the more effective, the bodily sensations. And so with that expressive therapies continuum that I explained, so the bottom level of this involves the sensory components. So basically the expressive therapies continuum, it describes the way we interact with the art making process. And again, I'll get into more of the art media as a second component of this. So the first level of how we interact is sensory and kinesthetic. Sensory would be if you imagine like you're using a piece of Play-Doh or modeling clay, and you're really concerned with engaging your senses. So you're feeling what it feels like, the texture, maybe gently pressing your fingertips into it, seeing what that feels like, maybe the smell of the clay. And then the kinesthetic component is this polarity, sort of the opposite of that, where you're more focused on the movement. So this would look like maybe pounding the clay or more aggressively kneading the clay, really engaging your muscles in that movement. And as you shift from one to the other, you're less focused on the opposite end. Again, these are polarities. So if I'm more focused on the pounding of the clay and that kinesthetic movement, let's say I've got a lot of anger. I've definitely worked with a lot of kids in the past who had that anger just deeply in their bodies. And so they're concerned with the kinesthetic quality and nothing else. If you transition more into the sensory component, focusing on the texture, the smell, then you're not as focused on the kinesthetic. Um, if we move up to the next level of the three levels in the expressive therapies continuum, it is perceptual affective. So we engage with the art making process from a perceptual perspective by focusing on using line and value to create form. So you're creating like the definition of different figures and shapes, the difference between a foreground and a background, that kind of thing. And I guess I should say, so this sensory component and the perceptual are very much more left brained activities when we think about left brain versus right brain, where the kinesthetic and the affective are right brain. And so on the other end of the spectrum, what it looks like to engage on an affective level in the art is you're using more color, or you're expressing your emotions, and you're not so concerned with the form and making like recognizable shapes. You're just focused on the colors and the emotions. And then the third
Mm.
level is cognitive symbolic, with cognitive being engaging more of the left brain and symbolic being engaging more of the right brain. So cognitively, that deals with our recent memories, just our, like I said, our thinking brain, kind of the things we're aware of. And symbolic is coming up with symbolic representations of things we've been through. And so if someone comes into therapy with past trauma and they're not really connected to their body and their feelings, we might start at that cognitive level where they're telling the story of their trauma. They're drawing a picture of an event. Whereas if they come in and are not able to verbalize what happened to them, we just start with those sensory kinesthetic components. We just start with kind of playing with the art media and get into connecting to our emotions. It's in that more affective state, in playing with the materials, like for example, finger painting, that you're gonna be able to access sort of the subconscious emotions, kind of those things we shove down, the memories of the trauma. You're going to be able to access them in that state.